And one person who recognized that the price of liberty is robust defense was this man, my predecessor as chair of the 1745 Association, Dr. Christopher Duffy, who sadly passed away in November. And I must thank Emsley for organising the requiem in his memory this evening, which I'm sure will, in Emsley's safe hands, not be a mournful affair, but rather a recognition of the considerable contribution Christopher made during his life and the very great legacy he leaves us today, including we in the 1745 Association were very fortunate to have his companionship at our gatherings at Glenfinnan, Stirling, Edinburgh, Carlisle, Falkirk, and of course here at Culloden, where he did a lot of research in his later years. And he also has left a very considerable legacy in terms of his published work on military conflicts in the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries. Most relevant for us in the association is his book, The 45, published in 2003, and Fight for a Throne, which updated the 45 in 2015, incorporating his later research. And his work proved beyond reasonable doubt that so far from being doomed from the outset, the rising of 1745 could very well have succeeded had certain decisions been different. And today I'm hoping to build on his research by analysing 7 of those decisions and asking why they were taken when they were, what alternatives might have been considered. And in order to assist me in that venture, distinguished members of the audience, I'd like your assistance in answering a question. And my friend and esteemed colleague, Steve Lord, the Vice Chair of the Association, has agreed to take the vote. So it's by a show of hands, but this is a question. Who wants to be a millionaire? You are a contestant on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and have progressed to the £125,000 level. Using your last lifeline, a 50-50 choice, you are faced with a question to which you have absolutely no idea what the answer is. If you gamble, make a random choice, obviously you've got a 50% chance of guessing correctly, in which case you'll double your money to £250,000. But if you guess incorrectly, you walk away with just £30,000 if you know the game. On the other hand, you can say, I'm not going to gamble, I'm not going to answer the question, I'm happy with £125,000, I'll take the money and I'll finish the game. So you've got 2 choices. You're in the hot seat in Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, so you can't just abstain. You've got to either say, I'm not going to answer that question, I'll take the money and walk away with a guaranteed £125,000, or, you know what, I'm going to gamble, I'm going to take a 50% chance of doubling my money, and I know that if I lose, I'll just walk away with £30,000, so I'll lose £95,000. Right, okay. Everyone understand the question? No clarification required? Right. Okay, so Steve's going to take account. How many would opt for A and just simply take the money? Show of hands. And Steve will count so I can have a sip of water. Okie doke. And how many? No, and no influencing the, well, it's too late to influence the vote now, because presumably all those who wouldn't have taken the money, can you put up your hands? You would have gone for £250,000. And there are a few risk takers amongst us. So it's
the non-gamblers have it. 33 to 13.
33 to 13. So we've got a fair number of, in true Jacobite tradition, a fair number of gamblers amongst us. But most people decide to take the money. Now, this is interesting. The optimal choice in economic terms, highest expected value, if you choose not to answer the question, as 33 of you did, the majority did, you're guaranteed £125,000. So you walk home with £125,000. However, had you decided to gamble, you would have got £125,000. You've doubled. You've at least got £250,000 half the time. You could have then dipped out of the game. So the 50% of times you got it right, you'd have made an expected value of 125,000, and the 50% of the time you got it wrong, you'd have made obviously 30,000, half of which is 15,000. So the expected value of a gamble at £140,000 is actually greater than the expected value of taking the money. Furthermore, if you've got to £250,000, who knows? You might have discovered the question was really simple and you got to £500,000, and when you got to £500,000, you might have been able to answer that question as well and ended up walking away with £1 million. So in economic terms, the optimal choice is actually to gamble. However, one person who would have certainly sympathized with the majority is my first expert witness. This is Herbert Simon. He was a winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1978 for, and I quote the citation, his pioneering research into decision-making processes within economic organizations. And one of his seminal papers, which even I, at my advanced age, I can remember reading as a student, was called, it's published in 1955, and it was called A Behavioral Model of Rational Choice. And in that paper, he posited that we satisfice. That was a word he made up. It was a neologism. It was a combination of words satisfy and suffice. In other words, we don't optimize in the way that economic textbooks tell us rational men and women do. We satisfice. We arrive at a decision which is good enough, which suffices to meet our objectives. And he was the first person to come up with this finding, which has proved very robust and can be applied to the decisions taken by the Jacobites in 1745-46, as we shall see. And the person who developed his ideas, most influential in many of them, was Daniel Kahneman, who wrote a best-selling book called Thinking Fast and Slow. He won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002 and the Presidential Medal of Freedom, America's highest civilian award, in 2013. Here it's being presented to him by President Obama in the White House in November 2013. And the reason he called his book Thinking Fast and Slow is he said human beings have two modes of thought. Thinking fast, which he calls system one. That's when we have to take a decision quickly with imperfect information, as you did on the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire question. And there he says we use heuristics, or rules of thumb, to come to a decision. And so those people who took the money might have used a heuristic such as a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. I'd rather secure what I've got. Conversely, the 13 who decided to go for broke might have said nothing ventured, nothing gained. So it all depends what rule of thumb you're using. That determines what the outcome of your thought will be. And he set out his ideas. This is his best-selling book, Thinking Fast and Slow. It incorporated his ideas and those of his colleague Amos Tversky, who died in 1996, so did not share the Nobel Prize, but certainly would have done had he lived. And they developed what they call prospect theory. The choices we make depends on how we frame our prospects. Do we frame them in the sense that if we make the wrong choice, we're going to lose, it's a risk, we better be careful, which is presumably how those who took the money framed their choice? Or do we frame it as, if we get the choice right, our prospects will improve and we ought to go for it? Well, one person who framed the prospects in the latter form was Prince Charles Edward Stuart in 1745. Summer of 1745, he certainly believed his prospects, the prospects of his dynasty, the prospects of his supporters would be enhanced if he launched an expedition to Scotland. Now, why did he think this, you may wonder? And we get a clue in the opening lines of the narrative of his right-hand man, John William O'Sullivan, who sailed over to Scotland with him. And he said, John Murray of Broughton's arrival at Paris assured him, I am told, this is O'Sullivan was told, that the king's friends, by the king he means King James, Charles's father, not George, who they regard as the Elector of Hanover and a usurper, the king's friends would receive him with open arms, and that he did not even doubt that he would surprise all the forts and castles of Scotland, which would procure him arms and ammunition, and by those means he would be master of Scotland without being obliged to draw a sword. This was certainly encouragement enough for a young prince, says O'Sullivan. And this is an example of what psychologists call confirmation bias. What's happening is he's giving his ideas to someone who basically is an echo chamber who plays them right back to him in the form of Murray of Broughton. And he becomes part of a groupthink, which leads to clouded judgment. How do you avoid it? You try to get diverse opinion. You do not just rely on one person. Prince Charles could have done this. Prince Charlie could have done this. He could have, for example, consulted with his own father, whom he's hoping to put on the throne. He didn't do so. He could have consulted with his principal potential ally, the King of France. He didn't do so. Why didn't he do it? He didn't do it because he knew what their answer would be, which is do not launch the expedition now in these circumstances. Wait for a better time. So he was a victim of the first decision of confirmation bias. He confirmed what he already wanted to do. I want to go over there and I want to get the throne back for my father. Anyway, so off he goes. And on the crossing, he loses his main ship, the Elisabeth, is intercepted by HMS Lion off the coast of Cornwall. Quite a violent sea battle ensues. Over 100 men are killed. The Elisabeth has to limp back to the continent, carrying most of his munitions, his arms, and his force of several hundred volunteers from the Irish Clare Regiment. That was his nucleus of his army. So what does Prince Charlie do? Well, what he does is he carries on regardless. He decides to continue the campaign after the loss of Elisabeth. This is a painting of the raising of the standard at Glenfinnan, which is the property of the association, but hangs today for public consumption at Glenfinnan House Hotel, near the place where the first rally took place. Now, why did they continue? Why did Prince Charles decide to continue the campaign? And incidentally, O'Sullivan supported him in this, according to his narrative. This second decision is an example of what psychologists and economists call loss aversion, the sunk costs fallacy. Kahneman and Tversky point out that in human decision making, losses loom larger than gains. They've already invested a lot of time, money, and resource into this expedition. Hasn't gone according to plan. What we do in the sunk costs fallacy is we throw good money after bad, making an ever-increasing commitment of time, money, and resources in projects that are not going well in an attempt to salvage some value from the investment already made. How do you avoid the sunk cost fallacy? Well, you reframe the problem. You say, what would we do now if we were starting from where we find ourselves? And if you find yourself on the west coast of Scotland with 7 men with you, to quote the old joke, I wouldn't start from here, Charles. What you should do is write off whatever's been committed, forget about the Elisabeth, it's gone, start with a blank sheet of paper. If you were here with 7 men, what would you do? Well, what the Highland chieftains told Charles to do is go home. And he gave the famous response, I am come home and I've got no intention of going back from where I came from. So what he should have done was said, right, okay, here we are, what do we do? Arguably, what he should have done is exactly what the clan chieftain he met told him to do. Go back, regroup, get another army, get more money, and then come back and we might support you. Anyway, he goes on, as it happens. He raises the standard at Glenfinnan, he gains support, he marches south onto Edinburgh. The Jacobites score a surprise but definitive victory at Preston Pans, and they consolidate their position in Edinburgh. All the time now, momentum is with them and they're building up support. And they come to the third decision. the Council of War at Holyrood, October 30th, 1745, which votes to advance into England by one vote. There are two groups at this council. There's one which coalesces around Lord George Murray, is generally regarded as its leader, and they're in favour of just staying in Scotland and consolidating position in Scotland. In Who Wants to Be a Millionaire terms, they're in favour, let's take 125,000 and build from there. The group coalescing around the Prince wants to advance into England. Now, they are using different decision criteria. Lord George is using what economists call a max-min strategy. How do we maximize the chance of gaining our military objectives with minimum loss of life and minimum risk? And he's right to do that because he's a military commander. Any military commander should have concern for the welfare of his own men. Conversely, Prince Charles is a political leader. He's not a military commander. He frames the choice according to what we call a maxi-max strategy. How do we maximize the chances of maximum gains? He'd be one of the 13 voting, let's go for the £1 million. We don't want 125,000. We're going for the million. And he's also right that the way you get that is by marching into England and marching on to London. So how do you overcome? They're literally not on the same page, and this happens quite often in the campaign, that Lord George is using a maxi-min strategy. The Prince is going for maxi-max. Is there a third decision criterion you could use? Well, as it happens, I should say this is an example of the Allais Paradox. This is Maurice Allais. He's the winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1988, the first French winner. And he concluded that we answer questions differently, whether they're framed as achieving potential gains or avoiding potential losses. That's the Allais Paradox, dates from the early 1950s. Daniel Kahneman integrated that into his prospect theory, and he gave an example. An investment is said to have an 80% chance of success, sounds far more attractive than one with a 20% chance of failure. The mind can't easily recognize they are one and the same. So Kahneman has accepted the Allais paradox and integrated it into his theory. The Allais paradox is most often seen today in clinical decisions. If you're told, good news, your operation has an 80% chance of success, you're more likely to sign a consent form than if you're told, ooh, your operation could have a 20% chance of failure. We might say, well, actually, hang on a second, maybe not. How do we get around this? Well, there's a third decision criterion. This was one that the mathematical genius John von Neumann first identified almost 100 years ago. And von Neumann argued, how do we maximize our welfare? We maximize it by using a minimax criterion. And what von Neumann meant by that, I don't know if he used that word, but that's what economists now use. Minimize your maximum, choose the option that minimizes your maximum regret. Don't die wondering. In other words, you've got two choices. Which is the one, if it doesn't work out, I'm least likely to regret? And clearly, in Edinburgh on October 30th, you didn't want to die wondering, well, what would, if we just stayed in Scotland, what would have happened if we'd marched into England? Maybe there would have been a huge upsurge of support for the Stuart Restoration. Maybe, maybe we would have just walked into London. So by using this minimax criterion, certainly the advance into England, to me, was the correct decision at that time. Conversely, we now march into England through Preston, Carlisle, Manchester, on to Derby. 5th of December, decision number 4, the Council of War at Derby votes to retreat back to Scotland. So they reverse that decision. Now, this is an example of ambiguity aversion, what's called the Ellsberg Paradox. What Daniel Ellsberg discovered was people do not want to bet on situations in which the probabilities are not known. And the Ellsberg Paradox, he showed by experimentation, we may irrationally change our decisions to avoid ambiguity. Decisions under conditions of uncertainty are not difficult because of what we know, They are difficult because of what we do not know. And what the Jacobites didn't know when they got to Derby is what lay ahead of them. They knew what lay behind them in Scotland. They could evaluate the probabilities, in fact, they already had, of consolidating their position there. But they gained false intelligence. There's a massive army between them and London, which actually wasn't true. There wasn't an army there at all. But nevertheless, it was enough to persuade them, we need to go home. Now, in the Ellsberg Paradox, you should not change your strategy in a game halfway through. You should, if it was the right strategy to begin with, it remains the right strategy, unless you get very clear information otherwise. So how do you avoid this problem that you've got a position of uncertainty on the one hand and a position of quantifiable risk on the other? Well, I would suggest they should not have taken a decision on December the 5th at all. They should have battened down the hatches in Derby, sent an advance reconnaissance party, perhaps the cavalry under Lord Elcho, ahead to London. Let's scout out and find out exactly what the position is there. Let's gain more intelligence. In other words, they should have sought to eliminate the ambiguity. They should have sought more verified information before arriving at a decision in order to minimize uncertainty and ambiguity. Time spent in reconnaissance is really wasted, as they say in the military. If they'd have simply taken a few days, as they did in Carlisle, to send an advance guard down on horseback so they could travel rapidly to get more information, they'd have discovered, you know what, there is no army in London. Anyway, it's too late. They turn back and then they come to decision number 5. December 19th, 1745, leaving a garrison at Carlisle. Now, again, there's a split here between Lord George, who said we shouldn't leave anyone at Carlisle. Let's get the whole army back to Scotland, and Prince Charles, who accepted the proposal to leave 400 men in Carlisle under the military command of Colonel Francis Townley. Now, I think there's general consensus among historians that was a very bad decision to leave people at Carlisle. It was a completely wasted, futile sacrifice, because those 400 men didn't survive very long. Many of them were executed. Many more died in dungeons of starvation and thirst in Carlisle Castle, Carlisle Cathedral, and other prisons. What I think Lord George on this was right. What should have happened was the entire army should have retreated en masse back to Scotland. Why did that decision occur? Well, here we've got Richard Thaler, winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2017, for his contribution to behavioral economics, which includes the identification of what he called the endowment effect. It's a particular form of loss aversion. What we have, we hold. Actually, it's not new, this endowment effect. Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, 300 years before Christ, observed most things are differently valued by those who have them and by those who wish to get them. What belongs to us and what we give away always seems very precious to us. So we value things we have more highly than things that we don't have. How do you overcome the endowment effect? What should have happened at Carlisle was a question should have been reframed, not you know, we're holding this city. This is one city in England we hold. We're going to stay there, and hopefully someone will come back and relieve us. It should have been, if we didn't already have Carlisle, how many men would we be prepared to sacrifice to get it? And the answer was Lord George's answer. It's none, because Carlisle at that point was of no strategic value at all to them. Anyway, they go back to Scotland, leaving the 400 men to their fate. They then do gain another victory at Falkirk Muir on January 17th, 1746. But the sixth decision then is to retreat into the Highlands of Scotland rather than trying to hold on to central Scotland. And this sixth decision is an example of the affect heuristic. We make this, in my view, we make decisions. The affect heuristic is we make decisions based on how they affect us emotionally, hence the name affect. We go with our gut instinct when under time pressures with incomplete information. The clan chieftains at that time instinctively felt safer retreating to their home territory in the Highlands than fighting in the Lowlands. Lowlands is a different language, a different form of dress, a different culture. It's an alien land to the Highlanders. So they go back to the Highlands. And then how do you avoid this affect heuristic of being influenced by your emotions? Well, the answer is you seek expert advice or a critical friend who can give dispassionate counsel from an independent view, not affected by emotional factors that may cloud the decision. Anyway, there was no such independent advisor whom both sides. Prince Charlie wanted to stay in central Scotland. Lord George and his group wanted to retreat northwards, and eventually they overruled the prince. So they retreated northwards. There was no independent expert advisor whom they could jointly essentially act as a kind of consultant to bring them together. So that brings us to the final decision, which we're commemorating this weekend, April 15, 1746, 277 years ago, the night march on Nairn and the Battle of Culloden. These are examples of optimism bias, the tendency to become overly enthusiastic about a plan, overestimating the ease with which one will achieve one's objectives, and underestimating or ignoring potential obstacles that lie in the way. So, on the night of April 15th, 1746, the time it would take to march to Nairn was underestimated. The risk of the two columns, there's one column under Lord George, the other under the Prince and the Duke of Perth. Those two columns became separated in the darkness. They had not reckoned on these risks. And by the time dawn broke, they hadn't reached Nairn, and Lord George took the unilateral decision to retreat without consulting with the Prince. So, what can we do to counter optimism bias? Well, what they should have done was systematically identify and assess sources of risk and uncertainty and devised a strategy to mitigate them. For example, the two columns should have stayed in closer contact and communication. Only make a final decision about what to do when this exercise has been completed. The following day, they stood at Culloden. That's essentially the Prince's decision. Lord George wanted to retreat into the mountains. And again, that was an egregious example of optimism bias in that he couldn't believe that his Highlanders could be defeated in battle, even though they only had a biscuit and they were exhausted after this night march. It was the worst possible. And also, if you look at the land outside, it's flat. It's completely, as Lord George pointed out, unsuited for the Highland charge, which requires a downhill charge to hit the enemy at maximum impact. So that was an egregious example of optimism bias. So those were the 7 decisions which led to the tragedy of Culloden 277 years ago. In closing, one might observe that in 1745, Prince Charlie, he's aged just 24, is a leader of considerable courage, charisma, and clarity of vision. Landing on the west coast of Scotland with just 7 men, he succeeds in mobilizing a volunteer army of several thousand men, who then go on to defeat the regular British army at Prestonpans, at Clifton, and at Falkirk Muir. And had certain decisions been different, who knows, might well have succeeded in pulling off the most audacious coup in British history. However, having said all that, what finally destroyed Prince Charles Edward Stuart was not any external force, but a fundamental psychological flaw in his own personality, which I term Bonnie Prince Charlie syndrome. This is the propensity to see the world not as it really is, but as one would wish it to be, of which loss aversion, the sunk cost fallacy, confirmation bias, optimism bias, all the other biases of the mind that we have examined today are symptomatic. And in recent years, the research and insights of Nobel laureates Herbert Simon, Maurice Allais, Amos Tversky, and Daniel Kahneman I say must Tversky because, in my view, he should have got a Nobel Prize posthumously, if such a thing were possible. And Richard Thaler, who happily is still, Daniel Kahneman and Richard Thaler are still with us happily. Their insights have considerably enriched our understanding of finance and economics, and could, with advantage, be applied also to the study of history, so that we can better understand why flawed decisions were taken in the past, so that we can make better decisions today, and hopefully build a brighter future